Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. And I'm really happy to welcome back historian Roger Crowley. And Roger and I have talked before, of course, and this time Roger's very kindly agreed to come on to talk about the siege of Constantinople. So welcome back, Roger, to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Russell. We're 8 days away from the anniversary of the fall of Constantinople, the 29th of May. So, we're approaching an important date in the calendars of both Greeks and Turkish people, obviously for different reasons.
I can't quite believe that you've just given away the ending in the first two lines of our podcast.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know. The fact that it's called Istanbul is maybe a spoiler anyway.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, what does the name Istanbul mean? Because you've got Constantinople, you've got Byzantium, and you've got Istanbul. What are these? I mean, the name Constantinople is a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a debate around this. The general explanation is it's a corruption of the Greek, saying Eistin Polin, I'm going to the city, Eistin Polin. And the Turks took this to be the word. So that's probably where it comes from. And so it's a corruption of a Greek phrase, a Greek saying.
And was the city called Byzantium ever, or where do I get that idea from?
The city was always just called Constantinopolis, actually. Yeah, the city of Constantine in Greek, from day one, from 324, when Constantine founded it. It was his city, his invention.
Okay, so we've started with Constantine, who founds the city. And then I guess we have the fall of Rome. I don't know when you would place that, 410, 470. Is it worth just sketching out a little bit of the history of the Eastern Empire after the fall of the Western Empire?
After the fall of Rome in the
after the West has collapsed, what goes on in the East?
Well, the Eastern Empire was booming at that time, very well placed to trade with the world, and the Eastern Roman Empire expands and contracts a bit, but at its height in the 7th century, it stretches from Italy to Tunis, all the way around the Mediterranean, and it aggregates a huge amount of land to itself. It has a very strong sense of identified Christian mission. It has large and powerful armies, and it is really the dominator of the Eastern Mediterranean. But it goes through ups and downs throughout all that period that will change according to the pressures brought upon it from east and from west. Because where Constantinople sits, it sits on an axis, really, an east-west axis into the heart of Asia, and a north-south axis. The position of Constantinople at the mouth of the Bosphorus is strategically very, very important. Its position gives it great power because it straddles Europe and Asia, but it also makes it vulnerable to pressures from both sides. And so it's kind of like a concertina, expanding and contracting, feeling pressure, ripples from out of the heart of Asia, which are going to come in wave after wave as people are displaced from the heart of Asia. So this is a city that lives under stress, you could say. Sometimes it manages it well, sometimes it manages it not so well. And so the fortunes over a long period fluctuate quite dramatically.
And when you say they managed it well and not so well, can you give us an example of where they perhaps managed it very well? Can you give us some examples of the ups and downs?
Well, the ups and downs obviously come in relation to competing peoples round about. Islam is going to be a major confrontational point, and the loss of North Africa, the whole of the North African coast to Christianity, is something which is going to impact very powerfully on the fortunes of the city. But they manage it actually very well in relation to Islam as well. They lose land, but they really stop the rollout of Islam into Europe in a couple of sieges 100 years apart, when really the worldwide spread of Islam, which was something that was strongly believed was inevitable, is really brought to a grinding halt by the stubborn defense of Constantinople, these two famous sieges, which actually changed Islamic theology, because the initial idea was that the worldwide spread of Islam was inevitable. And they had to kind of revise their timescale, you could say, in relation to the fact that here was this rival monotheism, which they couldn't reduce. They couldn't crack Constantinople. So these kinds of pressures and counter pressures, successes and failures, are going to continue for a very long period, over centuries. And we have to think of the huge timescales within which this city lived. 1120 years. If Constantinople fell today, its foundation would be in the time of the Vikings. And it's continuous and seamless. Cities have different fortunes. Baghdad can be conquered by somebody and then, it will be altered. But this remains a Christian city with its monuments intact, its theology intact, and its sense of itself intact for a very, very long period. It's extraordinary, and the length of that existence is in itself remarkable.
And they have two pieces of, well, I don't know if you'd call them bad luck exactly, but they have two shattering things that happened to them. And one of these is Manzikert, probably butchering the name. And the other thing is the Fourth Crusade, which really knocks them for six. So do you want to say just a little bit about these two disasters?
Yeah, Manzikert is a confrontation with the Seljuk Turks. The Turkish people travel out of Asia very slowly, not like the Mongols. They're being pushed from behind. The sort of seismic waves are pushing people on. And the Seljuk Turks, Turkish-speaking people, enter Anatolia at the start of the 11th century. And 1071, the emperor of Constantinople, the Seljuks actually weren't really looking for a fight with Constantinople. They were more interested in beating out some Shia. But they meet at this place called Manzikert in central Turkey. And Byzantines rely quite heavily on mercenary troops. And I think the height of the battle, some of the mercenaries defected or certainly abandoned the battlefield. And the Byzantine army is shattered. And the emperor actually survives, but only by sort of kowtowing to the Sultan of the Seljuks. And this is a blow. It's a big blow because it really throws open Anatolia to the advance of Turkic tribal peoples. And within about 20 years, 30 years, they've reached the Mediterranean. And with this, we start to see the loss of land, the loss of manpower, the loss of food resources and taxation affecting the fortunes, wealth, and resources of the Byzantines and of Constantinople. So this is a doorway moment. The second one, of course, comes in 1204.
Just so I get the dates right, the Manzikert is
1071, yeah. I think perhaps before we talk about the Fourth Crusade, I think it'd be worth just ducking into where the Fourth Crusade comes from in terms of the relationship between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. The Crusaders who make their way around Europe during the First Crusade come to Constantinople. And it's quite an edgy relationship. They realize that these people, although they're all Christians, are culturally completely different. The Byzantines thought the Crusaders were unwashed, unruly barbarians, effectively. The other way around, they thought they were effete people. But one thing they do notice, this is a very wealthy city. And there are theological aspects tied up with this, which we might return to a little bit later on. But it's on the map, both the feeling of friction between these two Christian peoples. I mean, the Emperor of Constantinople just wanted the First Crusade off his land as quickly as possible. Right? He didn't want this trouble. And he really wasn't. What horrified the Crusaders at this period was that actually there were mosques in Constantinople at the end of the 11th century.
How interesting.
And the frictions along the frontier were not terribly great. They weren't up for a massive crusade against people on their doorstep, their neighbors, if you like, looking at it on a favorable day. So this kind of plays into the kind of memory, I think, of what happens. The Fourth Crusade is an extraordinary episode. And to be brief about it,
take as long as you like, because the Fourth Crusade is an astonishing episode.
Crusading army sets out from Venice. The Crusaders have done a deal with Venice to carry 30,000 men to the Holy Land. And this involves the Venetians in a year's preparation and stopping all their trading activity. When the Crusaders turn up, only 11,000 come. They can't pay the bill. And out of this comes a kind of rolling sort of set of IOUs, which unfold as they work their way down the Adriatic. The Venetians insist that they attack and capture the Christian city of Zara, with which they've got issues. And a pretender to the throne of the Byzantine throne appears and promises them payback if they will help him get back onto the throne of Constantinople. And this ends up with the Crusaders, who set out for Jerusalem, storming Constantinople in 1204, massacring a large number of Greek people who they regard, in the way that we talked about a little bit earlier, as people who are really not religiously quite acceptable and could be seen as the other, and the imposition of a Catholic dynasty on the city of Constantinople, which lasts for 60 years, is a shattering blow for the city.
And how do they manage to get in? Because Constantinople is fabulously well defended. So how do they manage to take the city?
They managed to take the city because the Venetians, who've got a great deal of nautical know-how, managed to construct bridges from the masts of their galleys onto the walls on the Golden Horn and establish a bridgehead and get into the city that way. And it was technically a remarkable achievement, and a great deal of both the blame and the success of this mission really rests on the shoulders of the Venetians, who are instantly in trouble with the Pope, who describes them as dogs returning to their own vomit.
Well, maybe fair enough. And, to this day, the horses that they stole from Constantinople are still, I don't think they're on display anymore in Venice. I think they've been taken down now, but they were at St. Mark's, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's all sorts of looted treasures, icons, pieces of marble, all sorts of stuff from Constantinople, which was carried away to Venice. And you can think of Venice as a sort of bric-a-brac of plundered pieces from the East.
Even worse than London, perhaps.
Even worse, far worse than London.
And what else did they manage to steal from Constantinople? Because I'm just thinking that as a historian, did they manage to steal any books? Was there sort of anything like that going on?
I don't have much recollection of them stealing books. What they did steal, of course, were, first of all, trade. The Venetians took over a great deal of the maritime trade of Constantinople, and the Byzantine government, if you can call it such, went into exile on the other side of the Bosphorus in Asia for 60 years. But they steal a vast amount of its possessions, its territorial possessions, its islands, Crete, Cyprus, the Aegean, the shores of Greece, and so they steal a whole trading network on which Constantinople depended, and so really they're draining out long-term wealth possibilities from the city.
So I guess Manzikert takes away their manpower. And the Fourth Crusade, after, they've crawled out from under the wreckage after 60 years, their trading network is gone.
That's right. And of course, the next gift which the Venetians and the Genoese are going to give the people of Constantinople, the Byzantines get control of the city again in 1261. But the next big hammer blow is going to come in the early 14th century, when Constantinople becomes the first port of call for the Black Death. And this is, there are various other nails in the coffin, but this sort of reduces the population of the city enormously. At its height, we think that Constantinople had a population of about 500,000. Probably by the 14th century, it was down to 100,000.
I actually had a very interesting podcast I did with Kyle Harper, who talked about the plague of Justinian. And it turns out that it's exactly the same disease as the Black Death. And it killed, they think about 40, 50, 60% of the population of Constantinople. And I guess weakened it so much that was perhaps one of the reasons why the tide of Islam was able to flow in quite as easily as it did.
Yes, I think, given that it was a crossing point for routes, ports of call and so on, you could say it's always going to be vulnerable to infection, really. I mean, you could say that of Heathrow Airport as well. It's got that kind of, passing through north, south, east, west location. And I guess that's going to make it, particularly as it was a very probably intensely, tightly packed population.
So you talked a little bit about how the Christians from the West rather despise the effete Byzantines. But it's much worse than that, isn't it? Because there's this religious schism which has, becomes a bone of contention between them. And so that, when times get tough for the Byzantines, the West is not necessarily willing to help until they can sort out the schism. And when I read about it in your book, what the fundamental problem was, it was quite staggering. So can we just explain what the key point was here?
Yeah, we have to accept that I called Byzantium, Constantinople, the first Christian empire. I had to be corrected by an Ethiopian who said that the Ethiopians had a Christian empire 30 years earlier. But you have to think of the Byzantines as being theologically obsessive people. I mean, there were times when so many army officers went into monasteries that the military capacity of the empire was threatened. And it really comes down to, it's a cultural thing, and the way that the rites of religious services were performed. Firstly, it was around the authority of the Pope. The Church in the West believed that the Pope was the supreme authority of the whole of the Christian Church. And this was not acceptable to the Eastern Christians. The second, and, from a secular point of view, 1,000 years later, it's a difficult one to comprehend, was the wording of the creed, which comes down to what they called the filioque, the and Son. Was the Holy Ghost descended from the Father, or from the Father and the Son? The Catholics had and the Son in this. The Byzantines believed that this was theologically incorrect. There was also stuff around the communal rituals, whether you use leaven or unleavened bread. Now, a lot of this stuff is cultural as much as anything else. But it comes to that point when they're trying to sort this out. Towards the end of the, or the middle of the 11th century, 1054, a delegation comes from Rome to sort this out. And it's not getting anywhere. And a cardinal marches into St. Sophia, the mother church of the Byzantines, slaps down on the altar a bill of excommunication and marches out again. And the Byzantines try and rush out and return this to him and say, no, we don't want this. But he'd gone home. He went home. And this really created an irreparable breach, really, between the two churches. And the anathema on the papacy was only lifted by the Orthodox Church in, I think, 1965.
And the anathema, is that I don't quite know what an anathema is, if I'm honest, but is this their response to excommunication?
Their counter-response, really. No, I think a lot of this actually is cultural, if we're going back to what we said about the First Crusade. But there will be attempts as we get further down the road, and the situation for Constantinople becomes more desperate, to try and patch this up. But it's always going to be a problem. And it's remained a problem into modern times.
I suppose part of the problem is that the Byzantines had an emperor, and the West no longer had an emperor, so the Pope was able to fill that space. But that wasn't the case in the East, right? They had the emperor, so their idea that they should be subservient to the Pope must have rankled against sort of their sense of imperial oneness, or whatever the expression is.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, and so some of the most fundamental things in the Christianity, happened in the Byzantine world. The Nicene Creed, hammered out by Constantine. So they felt that they had no reason to be subordinate to these people in the West.
Is it worth moving on to say a little bit about the Ottomans and where they came from?
The Turks, as I said earlier, are a migratory people who move west over a long period of time. And after Manzikert, they enter Anatolia, as I said, and they establish themselves in Anatolia. The actual appearance of the Ottomans happens towards the end of the 13th century. It's slightly surrounded in mystery. They're one of many tribal groups who establish a position in Asia Minor, in Anatolia. And one of those tribal leaders, a man called Osman, because Ottomans are literally the tribe of Osman, establishes a position. He's fortunate in the sense that he's in northern Anatolia, that he's the closest to the Byzantine presence, Constantinople, and that puts him in a position to sort of wage jihad, you could say, with some justification. And he manages to reignite a kind of jihadi spirit. At the same time, it has to be said that quite a number of Christian schismatic groups in Asia Minor really didn't like the Constantinople burden, heavy on taxation and resource extraction. So in many respects, they actually won, when I say converts, but people who were Christians who were not unhappy to have thrown off what they saw as the yoke of the emperors of the city. So they had a bit of internal help from the Christian world. But Osman starts to get going. And in the 14th century, we see them starting to, they're great nomadic raiders, but the problem they have is actually besieging cities. And they have to learn this. And they slowly, key moments are when they take the city of Bursa, as the Turks call it, in the middle of the 14th century. So they're starting to develop skills. Where
is Bursa? Is that in?
Bursa is, it's across the water. It's about 60, 70 miles from the northern coast of Anatolia. It's not a big distance from across the water from Constantinople.
Right.
And they also take Nicaea, Iznik, another very important Christian city. So they're starting to develop a wide range of skills. At the same time, in the 14th century, the Byzantine world is suffering fragmentation in terms of huge internal feuding among imperial factions, and they manage to insert themselves into the civil wars of the Byzantines, who don't help themselves really. It becomes pretty dysfunctional as to who's going to be the emperor, and so you get various groups. And eventually they're helped across the water to take part in Byzantine civil wars. They're taken across by, I think, on Venetian ships, and they can't be dislodged. And so they start to filter out into the Balkans. And although this is military conquest, there is also winning of hearts and minds. They didn't ask Christians to convert. Their taxation burden was lower than it was under rule from Constantinople. So, they enter Serbia, Bulgaria, and we start to see that the heartland of Byzantium really starting to shrink and shrink and shrink, that Constantinople controls less and less land on the European shore, still the whole of Greece, but it's being systematically surrounded on all sides.
And then, well, I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I suppose we sort of are. Mehmet turns up and he takes the throne at a very young age. I hadn't appreciated how young he was when he ascended the throne. So are we at the stage of the story when we can talk about him?
Yes, we can. His father, Murat, had there were 5 sieges by the Ottomans of Constantinople before 1453. They were starting to have a crack at it. They were again supporting various rival contenders for the throne. The Byzantines had a countermeasure of releasing Ottoman princes to stir up trouble. But in the early 15th century, Murat, for reasons which are not quite clear, decides to abdicate or retire in favor of his son, Mehmet, who's only 12 or 13 at the time.
It does seem extraordinary that. I mean, I can imagine somebody might abdicate in favor of Prince Charles, whose age, whatever it is, but to abdicate in favor of your 12-year-old son seems like a recipe for disaster.
Well, he was under control of various governors and so on. But from an early age, he's very headstrong, and he makes a complete hash of it, really. He stirs up all sorts of theological trouble by courting a kind of Shia mystic, bring him into the court. the standing army of the Ottomans start to rebel, and Murat has to come back again and take over. So Mehmet has one failure to his name already at a very early young age. Like all Ottoman princes, he's of mixed ethnic origin, because generally the Ottomans produce their children from enslaved women rather than from dynastic marriages. And he was probably the son of a Slavic woman, and multicultural in a way. He spoke Turkish and Ottoman Turkish and everyday Turkish, Greek, and probably a Slavic language. So he was kind of quite widely culturally attuned. But eventually, when Murat dies, and obviously he becomes Sultan, he's got a sort of black mark against his name in a way that but he has this burning desire to succeed. And one of the books which influences him is the biography of the life of Alexander the Great, which he has read to him. And he conceives himself as an Islamic Alexander, reversing the tide of conquest from the west to the east, back from the east to the west. And it's kind of like his role model, which is quite a complicated one, really. It's as much about imperial desire to gain the title of Caesar. People are very hung up on being heirs to the Roman Empire. It has a resonance even in the Islamic world. The Caesars are great figures in the imagination of the whole of Europe. So becoming Caesar and capturing Constantinople, the city of the Caesars, is what fuels him into wanting to have a crack at the city almost as soon as he becomes Sultan again at the age of about 21.
And you say have a crack because, of course, it is still at that stage. It still is an extremely tough nut, isn't it?
It is. And it's a dangerous prospect for Mehmet, because if he fails, he's in deep trouble, really. It has to be said that he is the only survivor of his brothers and sisters or his brothers, I should say, who have either died or been killed. And the aim of the Ottoman succession was the last man standing among the children. And the first thing you did, if you could become Sultan, is you killed off any surviving brothers who might threaten you. One of the things they learned from the Byzantines is that lots of feuding brothers cause a heck of a lot of problems for you. And the horror of seeing these civil wars, these factional feudings going on in the later stages of the Byzantine Empire were kind of like an object lesson to them. So he is a survivor, but it's still a dangerous thing. He's failed once. He can't afford to fail again.
Constantinople, it's not just, a wonderful dream for Mehmet. There is a strategic consideration here. There is a real reason, isn't there, for them taking the city?
Yes, there is. And it is its position, the axis, particularly that it controls the routes to and from the Black Sea, which are potentially quite valuable in terms of food and resources. The Ottomans now have camel routes all the way down, across Anatolia into Syria and so on. But that sea route and then back into the Mediterranean is very, very valuable. And it allows you to dominate terrain, as we said earlier. So it has great strategic value as well as prestige value in cementing for the Ottomans a sense that they have arrived as a great imperial power.
And it's not just that, because the Byzantines haven't helped themselves, or maybe they have helped themselves, it's hard to tell. It's damned if you do and damned if you don't, but they've been interfering in Ottoman politics and stirring up trouble. And they're also a focus of where, if the Christians ever get their act together, that could be a mighty thorn in the Ottoman side, right?
Yes, and there had been a couple of crusades. The most recent one was at Varna in 1444. And there always the fear that a united Christendom could come back at them was one that definitely played in the minds of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so Mehmet's decided he needs or wants to take the city. So how does he set about the task? What's his plan?
His first act is to cut off Constantinople from the Black Sea. And he builds two forts on the Bosphorus, one on the European side and one on the Asian side. And in fact, he builds a very prestigious fort on the European side. There was an Ottoman fort on the Asian side already. This would allow him to control the straits and to stop any supplies coming down from the Black Sea, where the Venetians and the Genoese are trading, and pass through the city and brought in foodstuffs and so on. And so there comes a point when a Venetian galley tries to run the gauntlet through the straits, past this pinch point of the two forts, and gets shot to pieces by an Ottoman cannon. So he seals off that route of support. The other thing he has to do, really, is to bring together people he has to gather people in the cause of jihad. And one of the things that we've not talked about is the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th century. And these were terribly important, I said in terms of the theology of Islam, but they left a kind of legacy of historic religious memory for Islamic people. The Prophet's standard bearer, Ayub, died at the first siege of Constantinople in 671, which gave it a kind of religious resonance. And it left behind a whole range of prophetic sayings and quotations, a lot of which were actually forged, I think, but which were dug up at the time of Mehmet's attempts to take the city, about how the Prophet Muhammad had said that the city would be taken. And so they managed to suck in a great deal of religious fervor for holy war around this enterprise. At the same time, they start to collect material. And we think of the Ottomans as being very good fighters, very fierce fighters, but they were also extremely good at the logistics of warfare, at collecting the stuff. We're good bean counters, actually. You need to make sure that you've got horses, wood, materials for weapons, food supplies. And so they start to bring all this material together in a huge rolling effort in the year running up to the siege.
And I think they were also technically surprisingly advanced, because they had some great guns, did they not?
They did. They acquired cannons really from cannon founders in the Balkans, probably from about 1400. Murat, Mehmet's father, had brought about 20 cannons to the walls of Constantinople in 1422. They actually hadn't done much damage, but they were good at sourcing the material. A lot of the bronze for their cannons came from melting down the church bells of the Balkans, gathering the components for gunpowder, saltpeter, and so on, sourcing places where you could obtain, good hard rocks for making cannonballs. And the logistical efforts required to bring all this stuff together were formidable, actually. But they were very, very good at it. And they were casting cannons in the first half of the 15th century at larger and larger sizes. In the run-up to the siege of Constantinople, one of these itinerant Christian cannon founders turned up, a man called Orban, Hungarian, with the technical know-how to make very large cannons. He'd gone, first of all, to Constantine and offered his services. But cannons are expensive things to make, and you need a lot of cash. And Constantine just simply didn't have the cash. So he then trots off up the road, 140 miles to Edirne, which is west of Constantinople on the European side, which was then the Ottoman capital, and offers his services to Mehmet and says, I can make you a cannon that will bring down the walls of Babylon. And there's an extraordinary account of the founding of this cannon, how it's made, a huge mold is made. And out of this comes this enormous gun, 27 feet long, which will fire a very large stone ball of about half a ton. And they have a kind of test firing outside the walls of Edirne. And the women are told to go inside unless they miscarriage when they hear the sound of this gunfire. And by all accounts, it gives an incredibly impressive performance. It travels a mile for a mile across the land and buries itself 8 feet in the ground and so on. And so he gathers about various cannons of different sizes, about 60, which is a huge number, and represents an enormous effort. And he starts to bring these things very slowly towards the walls of the city. He gives Constantine good warning that this cannon was called the royal gun, the basilica, that this thing is coming, and it travels sort of about 2.5 miles a day, the 140 miles, and it requires a huge amount of effort. There are an awful lot of support troops involved in Ottoman warfare, so they have to have men to strengthen the bridges so this thing can travel over rivers. And the fact that this great super gun is coming towards you was, a psychological calling card as well as a military weapon. And so this thing is going to pitch up at the walls of Constantinople at the start of late March, early April in 1453.
You've mentioned Constantine a few times, and maybe we should just say that Constantine is at that time the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, right?
Mehmet was about 21, Constantine was in his late 40s, and he'd spent all his life, adult life, trying to resist the incursions of the Ottomans into the Peloponnese. And his brothers were all a basket of snakes, actually, and one of them had been involved in one of the sieges, I think one of Murat's sieges on the side of Murat. And his mother, Helen, said that Constantine was, the only trustworthy son that she had. And he actually had some experience of Ottoman cannon fire because he had built a wall across the Isthmus of Corinth, the Hexamilion, the 6-mile wall. And this had been blasted to bits by Murat, Mehmet's father. So he knew to a certain extent what was coming. He's a slightly colourless character in the sense that we don't know as much about him as we would like to. I think really because in the dying days of the empire, nobody had time or effort to chronicle stuff, to make pictures and so on. But we have a man who is a soldier. He is not a theologian, and this is going to play out in the relationship that he has with his Greek Orthodox population in relation to the religious schism. Absolutely dedicated to, he sees himself in this long tradition of emperors that goes back 1,100 years. He's not the man who is going to drop the ball. He feels the weight of history, of Byzantine history on his shoulders. It is his responsibility to save the Christian city from the horde of Islamic warriors. And he will go down to the last man if he has to defend this legacy.
And you mentioned the problems that he had with his fellow Christians inside the city, with his fellow Orthodox Christians. So this is because he's reaching out to the West to try and get help from the Western Christians. So how does that develop?
Well, his father went on a tour of Europe, actually, and actually including England, to try and levy support for the cause. So you can see what's coming. At a religious attempt to solve this problem, the Council of Florence in 1439, they agree a settlement, which really means that the emperors of Constantinople will submit to the authority of Rome. And this requires ratification in the great mother church of Saint Sophia, which never happens. Constantine is a soldier. He's not a theologian. He's less concerned about the intricacies of theology as he is in saving his city. And he becomes, to a certain extent, unpopular with his people for the stance which he's taking, which he inherits from his father. He is meant to be crowned in St. Sophia. He isn't, because he fears the reaction of many of the Greek people. And so, in a sense, he's never fully legitimized as the emperor. And it's going to be a tough challenge for him to unify the population of the city in not what is an unpopular cause, but for an emperor who isn't legitimized. And the stridently Orthodox population desert St. Sophia. This is the great mother church of the city. and it becomes the dark church that has been abandoned by the Orthodox population of Constantinople. And in a sense, the abandonment of the church is kind of a metaphor maybe for, that the Christ-given protection of the city is disappearing.
It is quite extraordinary that the churchmen of Constantinople, theology is more important to them than the practical help that they can get from the West. It's just mind-boggling to us looking back at it from a different age, I guess.
Yes, I mean, you have to put yourself in the position of understanding just how deeply ingrained was the Orthodox religious world. And I mean, there was a neat catchphrase of the time of our part of the population that rather the Sultan's turban than the Pope's hat or Pope's mitre. So, I mean, the level of the hatred, which of course the 1204 siege hadn't helped this at all in any way, and the hatred of people from the West is so deeply ingrained in people, really, that there was a feeling that they would actually prefer to be ruled by Islam than to be ruled by the Catholic Church. And this is the kind of a position which is, deeply ingrained in the fervent Orthodox religious belief of many of the people.
And it is interesting, at least it's one of these ironies, is that the emperor who founds the city is Constantine. The emperor at the time of the siege is Constantine. And I was quite entertained by the fact that his chief Italian helper is a man called Justiniani or something of that sort.
Well, yes. There are many resonances. The other part of that is the prophetic thing was that the city was founded and would fall under an emperor called Constantine, whose mother was called Helen. And this plays out as well, really. The other thing about the huge, long, deep life of this city was it was riddled with prophetic beliefs, really, about the end of time. And, these people are not only very religious, but they're prophetically imbued with all kinds of signs and omens about the end of time and the end of the world, all kinds of stuff, actually. But yes, those parallels, Justiniani and Justinian, yeah, there's a good one.
So the siege begins. So what happens as the siege begins? Do the guns, are they successful? What happens next?
Just to give you a brief kind of mental geography of the city, it's triangular. Two sides are surrounded by water, one side by the Sea of Marmara and the other by the sort of creek, the Golden Horn. The third side, the land side, is 4 miles long and it's protected by a wall. And really, the front which the Ottomans could attack is this 4-mile wall, the Theodosian Wall, which is an incredible piece of military engineering going back to the 4th century AD, which nobody had ever been able to crack. And if we think of this city as living for 1,100 years, it survived 23 sieges, one siege every 40 years. And after the Bible, the book that was most popular in Constantinople was the Iliad, the siege of Troy. So these people live with siege, and their defense there was the Theodosian Wall, which was a triple level wall of a high wall, a lower wall, and a moat with something like 190 towers on it. Nobody had the technology to crack this thing. They had two defenses, really. One was the wall, and then a spiritual defense in their icons. They had a particularly important icon of the Virgin who shows the way, the Hodeitri, I think they say in Greek. And they would parade their icons on the wall. So they believed as much in the spiritual defense as they did in the military defenses. But this is the wall which nobody has been able to take. The Russians have been here, the Arabs have been here, the Bulgars have been here. Nobody has had the technology to crack this extraordinary piece of military fortification. And this is really what Mehmet's up against. His father had come with guns and peppered it and had no effect at all. So he's trying to do something which has baffled invading armies for almost as long as the city's been in existence.
And the wall is 4 miles long, you say. So how many men do the Byzantines have to man the wall?
They have 7,000 and something actually counted. They were able to count their men. You know, their fighting force was really quite small. And I think there were a lot of refuseniks among the Orthodox who weren't going to do the fighting. So it's a mixture of Greeks, of soldiers of fortune who came for a cause, and Venetians. The resident Venetian population contributed. There were Catalans. It's kind of a pan-European, really. And the man who is put in charge of the defences is this Giovanni Giustiniani, who is a soldier of fortune, but an expert in what they call wall fighting, really, and in the defence of cities. And he is really Constantine's general in charge of manning the walls. But 7,000 men, of course, have to be rotated anyway, along a 4-mile sector is spreading it pretty thin. On the Ottoman side, trying to judge very large crowds, as we know, as Donald Trump found at his inauguration, is very difficult. And you can always divide the number. The Christians would say were 400,000 men, possibly about 80,000. You can't tell. The problem with the Ottomans is they always come with tons of horses and camels and support corps and cooks and bottle washers and all that kind of stuff. But the numbers are disparate, really. Between the two sides are just huge, really, astronomically.
And the city does get some relief, doesn't it? Because there's a sort of a small relief fleet that arrives and the Ottomans set upon it with their galleys.
Yes, in the end, the Pope does send a couple of grain ships. There are 4 ships, and these are high-sided sailing ships. Mehmet has created a fleet, much to the surprise of the Christians. The Ottomans are very good at co-opting the resources of their subject people. And this is a fleet of galleys, about 70 ships, I think, really Greek, manned by Greeks. And these 4 ships approach the walls of the city to bring supplies, and Mehmet's fleet comes out to intercept them and, capture them, and fails miserably, actually, watched by the whole of the Ottoman army. It's a bit of a low point for Ottoman morale. The galleys are very low in the water. They're bombarded from above by these quite stout sailing ships. And there's a chain across the Golden Horn which protects Christian ships within it. And this is opened. The 4 ships go in, and the Ottomans' first naval venture ends in complete failure. And I think Mehmet was going to kill the admiral, but he's let off lightly. But it's a moment of humiliation for the Ottoman cause for a short while.
If they're not going to be able to do much with their fleet, what are they able to do with their guns?
They're able to do quite a lot with their guns, actually. They manage to maintain, they've got about, we're not quite sure, 60 or 70 cannons of different sizes, from the very large ones, this basilica, down to, quite small guns. And they're able to keep these firing for over 40 days, which is a remarkable feat of logistics. You get some masons on the shores of the Black Sea you send them this dimension that you need your cannonballs for each thing, and you get them shipped over. So keeping them supplied in gunpowder, cannonballs, and so on was extraordinary in its own right. And the psychological effect of these things, shattering the walls, was profound on the people. It had the terror. Certainly, the people felt this was like an end of the world moment. Constantine had 1 or 2 cannons, but they demonstrated the extent to which the Theodosian wall was now militarily obsolete. Because when he put his cannons on the platforms on the top of the towers, the vibration and the recoil of these things started to shake the foundations of the towers. So, they couldn't actually use they didn't have many cannons, but it was kind of an indication that this great defense system was obsolete, effectively. They're very slow to fire. I mean, I think the largest cannon can fire about 7 shots a day. It's not fast. They get a little bit of tips from some visiting Hungarians who say, what you need to do is you bombard in a V. You get two small shots and then a big shot. And you just concentrate, focusing on one small piece of wall, what they call the bear and its cubs. And the Ottomans said, thank you very much. And so they started to pepper the walls in a much more concentrated way. And they started to make really quite substantial breaches. These were filled up by the support of the population, and people did join in, dragging whatever they could find in to fill up the gaps. And this tended to be earth and wood. And actually, this makeshift defense was extremely effective, because rather than shatter something, the stone balls were kind of just absorbed into the soft mud, actually. And these makeshift barricades really work quite well.
When the Turks attack, what are the Greeks fighting back with? Are they stabbing them with spears and swords? Are they shooting them with arrows? Are they shooting them with? Do they have guns at this stage? What are they using to repel attacks?
Yeah, well, mainly it's swords, javelins, crossbows, longbows. They did have some handguns actually, but really it's so slow to load and fire one of these, the primitive things, that it would boil down to hand fighting actually. And what would happen is that they would make a breach in the walls, and then Mehmet would incite his men to make an attack. One of the things they had to do along the way was try and fill in the moat. We're not sure whether there was any water in the moat, but I think there probably wasn't. But it was still deep, and therefore a lot of effort went into trying to throw stuff into the moat, including dead bodies of their own men, to create a bridge across. And then there would be a mad rush for what would be really quite a narrow aperture. And of course, and this was kind of quite easy to defend. And although some of these were quite desperate, the defenders did pretty well at slaughtering these people who were being defiled into narrower and narrower points of entry as they neared the wall.
If the walls are being repaired pretty effectively, I mean, it must have been exhausting for the defenders, because there's not so many of them, and presumably there's fewer and fewer of them as the siege goes on. How are the Ottomans able to sort of counter this? What turns things their way?
I suppose it's really attrition. There were some low points in Ottoman morale when they've been there for a long time, 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks, and it's difficult to keep, because a lot of these people are volunteers who have just turned up, and people will drift away. And although we kind of, it's easy to concentrate on the religious fervor of the whole thing, a lot of people were there just for the stuff, really. The idea that, that this was an incredibly rich city, which unfortunately wasn't nearly as rich as it had been. So there are low moments in this, and there are one or two things that happen along the way. I mean, the Golden Horn, which is closed to Ottoman ships, Mehmet has his ships dragged over a mile over land and launch into the Golden Horn, and it's an incredible psychological coup. But what in the long run, it's the attritional effect of gunfire just making larger and larger gaps in the wall, which are harder and harder to defend, and also the whittling down of manpower. What started as 7,000 men probably gets down to about 4,000 or under that to man of what is effectively a 12-mile perimeter. They had to have some men on the sea walls of the other two sides, and the sheer exhaustion of, it's continuous. There was an Italian who wrote a diary of this, and it's night after night after night. It's like something in the First World War. They're coming and they're coming again, and this is just wearing away at the morale, the stamina, the ability to relieve troops with rotating corps of men. And so it comes to a point where after 45 days, I think Mehmet realizes that he's either got to go for it or he's going to exhaust the patience of his army. And that's the point at which he thinks that now everything has to be put into a final assault.
So at this point, things are, I wouldn't say they were finely balanced, because clearly the Ottomans that's where you would put your money. But the Christians still have hope that they might get a relief force. And they send out a ship, don't they, to try and find out, where is this relief force? Is it coming? I thought that was quite a remarkable story.
There are extraordinary little very moving mini dramas within the grand drama, and Constantine is still hopeful that somebody might come. His hope was in two directions. One was from Hungary, despite the helpful Hungarians who
Yes.
provided a few tips. There's John Hunyadi, I think his name is, the great Hungarian prince, would come to their rescue. The other was that after the few ships which had come, that there would be a relief force from the west. So he sends out a small Venetian ship, disguises itself as a Turkish vessel, and slips away down the Dardanelles into the Mediterranean, and conducts a kind of tour of the islands to find out what's going on. Is there any sign of anything coming? And they're one of those islands somewhere in the Aegean, and the men on this ship have a conference really as to what are they to do, and it's obvious that nobody is coming. And one man proposes, well, there's nothing more we can do, we should sail away. But he's outvoted by the rest of the crew, who say, no, whatever we do, even if we die, we should go back and tell the emperor what the situation is. And so they slip back down the Sea of Marmara, disguise themselves as a Turkish ship, manage to make it back into the Golden Horn and report back to Constantine. And the emperor weeps when he hears the fact that there is no relief, but he thanks them for coming back, that they've, given their all for the cause. It's very moving, one of many very moving little episodes in the middle of the whole tale, I think.
For me, the true hero of the siege is of course the only Scotsman who is there.
Yes, John Grant. I had some inquiries from the Grant clan about this at one point, as to what further light I could throw on this John Grant.
Why, had he stolen some of their cutlery?
No, they wanted to claim him as a great member of the Grant clan. He came via Germany, we know. He is an example, I think, of one of the technical mercenaries who can be found across Europe with a particular skill. He is obviously a mining engineer. Unfortunately, we know very little about him apart from this one episode where he is really in charge of countermining. The Ottomans they look for resources everywhere. Serbian silver miners, very good at digging holes. And as the siege wears on, they're trying all sorts of different techniques to get under the walls. They start digging mines to get under the walls. John Grant is in charge of the defense of this, and he's quite a smart guy. They have various techniques for detecting these. One is to have a bucket of water on the ground by the wall. And if you get little tremors on it, you know that there's something going on nearby. And so Grant organizes countermining, and you get these extraordinary underground battles, horrible, where the Christians intercept the Ottoman mines and pull down the pit props and suffocate the miners. There's a vicious little war going on underground, and Grant is extremely successful at counteracting the mining phase of Mehmet's campaign. That is his contribution. Unfortunately, we know nothing more about him than that, but I think it's an extraordinary. I mean, you get all sorts of little characters. There are Catalans there who turn up. But John Grant, the Scotsman, has his
day in the sun, so to speak.
The Scots have their day in the sun at the siege of Constantinople.
Well, I'm sure he made it back home sort of with some candlesticks under his arm or something of that sort. So we have the final assault. And there's another strange thing where it seems that the Greeks are able to, or I say the Greeks, but the Christians, because it's unfair to say just the Greeks, despite all the harm the Venetians had done to the city, nonetheless they're there fighting for it. At least some of them are. And I think that they used to sally out from small gates to sort of cause trouble to the people attacking the walls. And there's a really confusing story where you say that they went back in after one of these sallies and they forgot to close the door.
Well, that's what we're led to believe. I mean, it's very difficult to nail down some of the facts around this, quite honestly. But as far as we understand it, there are these sally ports, and every now and then they would sally out. And one of the reasons for sallying out, actually, was In some cases, it was obviously to counterattack, but sometimes it was to try and just empty the moat.
Oh, yeah.
So, so it had a depth to it, and they're trying to fill it in with stuff. And in the final assault that takes place on the 29th of May, a small party sally out one of these sally ports and forget to close it. There was a Byzantine prophecy about, about a gate that would cause trouble at some point in the final end of days. And forgetting to close it, some Ottoman soldiers get in, they get up on the wall and plant a flag. It's only a kind of short-term thing because they are overcome and hurled off the wall, but it spooks people quite badly, I think. And further down the line, I guess they see the flag going up there. They're not probably so aware of what happens afterwards, and the feeling that the Ottomans are coming, they're already inside the walls. And so this damages the morale of the defenders quite badly. It's a jolt, but suddenly we're no longer winning. So, that was one thing. I mean, it has to be said that for quite a number of hours, the Christians held their ground very well. And it almost gets down to the last, wave after wave of men are sent in. And the Ottomans always send in their most disposable troops, first of all, which would probably be Christian vassal soldiers who have been compelled to come. So you send them in first and they get slaughtered. And then you send in slightly less valuable ones and so on. But it got to the point where was getting to the point where it's do or die. And at that point, Mehmed has to send in his Janissaries, his crack troops for the final attack. They've done very well, the Christians, but the defense really hinged upon a sector of walls about a few hundred meters. And because Constantine did not have enough men to defend both layers of walls, they'd taken a decision to defend the outer wall. And on the last day, he decides this has got to be do or die. There'll be no going back. So the 2,000 men who are left to guard the key attack point are marched into the walls, and the gates are locked behind them. And Constantine has the key to the gate round his neck. It's going to be do or die. Justiniani is there. He's already been wounded, actually, and he's probably exhausted. He's been fighting for 5 weeks, nearly 6 weeks. But he's there. He is kind of like the iconic figure. He's the man who everybody trusts as being, he's the mastermind. And in the middle of this final last assault, he is suddenly very badly wounded. And there are all sorts of explanations as to how he was wounded. But it seems that probably some kind of shot pierced his armor, and kind of invisible to the naked eye, but he knew he was mortally wounded. And he said, I can't fight anymore. I need to leave the field of battle. Give me the key. Let me retire. And there's a kind of conversation in the middle of this hubbub of battle of Constantine saying, if you go, we're lost, because people will see that, you've gone, and the morale will drain away. And Justiniani, to his eternal discredit, as he's given by our wise people afterwards, says, I can't fight anymore. So the door is unlocked. He goes. It's one gate, and it's not a very wide one. And when the defenders, they've been spooked by this appearance on the walls a bit further up, and then they see Justiniani going, they waver, and morale just cracks. They all kind of rush for the exit, but of course the exit is blocked because it's one gate and lots of men trying to get in. At that point, of course, they're no longer attending to the defense, and the Ottomans manage to get up on the walls behind them and trap and massacre these men from behind, and it's all over at that point.
So what happens to Constantine in the end?
Well, it remains a mystery. The Turks say that he was caught running away and was killed. The Greeks believe that he disappeared in the melee and went down fighting. There was no clear identification of a body. So it remains uncertain. The Greeks had a sort of counterfactual story that he escaped and that, he would rise again in some form or another in post-Byzantine history. But I guess emotionally one likes to think that he went down fighting because he'd given his life, he'd given his all for this, really. He'd gone in for the final moment of battle with a locked gate behind him, do or die. And I can't really bring myself to believe that he did run away. So I'd like to leave him there dead on the battlefield, but unidentified.
He was given the chance to run away more than once, wasn't he? He was sort of begged to leave the city and save himself, I think.
Yes, he was. And this was something that was suggested to him on several occasions, that he should retreat, I think, to the Peloponnese and make a stand there. But he was deeply committed to the preservation of the imperial line of Byzantium in Constantinople. He saw it as his duty and his obligation after 1100 years of imperial rule that he should not be the man who should abandon the ship.
And generally, do people manage to escape the city, or are they trapped there by the Turks?
Most of the resident population are trapped, and figures of something like 50,000 Greeks being taken away as slaves is a figure that's bandied around. All these figures are apocryphal. The people who get away are the people who have got access to ships, and there are about 18 mainly Venetian vessels in the harbour, and therefore it's going to be, as is the case in these things, the wealthy and the maritime community, the merchant community, who have a place on a ship or ownership of a ship. So quite a lot of Venetians get away. Some of the very wealthy people get away. The Archbishop Leonard of Chios, who was a Catholic bishop who'd come to try and enforce the reconciliation of the two religions, and various other important people. But it seems that a lot of ordinary Greeks escape one way or another, because we know that by the late 1470s, there are 4,000 Greeks in Venice alone. And they mainly went to Italy or to Crete. And I suspect if some of the ships were Greek, then that might have been an opportunity for Greeks to get away. But I suspect that quite a lot of the people who pitch up in these other countries probably didn't escape at the time, but somehow filtered out later on in one way or another.
Do you think, was that the critical moment in the siege, or were the Ottomans coming back again next week, the week after, or was that really do or die, where if perhaps Justiniani had not been injured, or if Constantine had refused to let him go, was that the critical moment in the siege, or is that just a bit too convenient?
It's very difficult to know. I suspect that there was more to it than Justiniani. I suspect that the men were worn down, the gaps in the walls were too big. They simply couldn't sustain the defense. If they had sustained that final attack, it's unknown what would have happened. I think that Mehmet might have used up his capital of goodwill at that point and, had to retire. In the long run, Constantinople was doomed, really. It was too isolated. It's surrounded on all sides. And if not that year, next year. So there's no way, when you look at it in sort of geostrategy, that it could have survived. It could have survived Mehmet's, bid for glory. What the consequences of his failure would have been, I don't know, because he was the only survivor of the Ottoman dynasty. But I think at that point, Ottoman sieges, the psychological life of an Ottoman siege is really about 50 days. And they knew that, I think they realized that, and this was sort of 47 days, that you couldn't keep men there for much longer. the whole business of bringing large groups of men together and camp and hygiene and morale and so on, that probably they would have given up on that occasion.
So what happens in the Ottoman Turks if they burst in, and what happens in the city? What happens to the population?
Well, initially they pour in. Initially, there's a massacre, but very quickly they realize that there is no resistance, and at that point, it moves to looting, plundering, and capturing people because slaves are valuable, and they work their way into the city. Mehmet makes a ceremonial entry into the city and makes his way down, all the way down to St. Sophia. There are said to have been 10,000 people sheltering inside. It is a huge building, and that's not, that may be a slightly inflated number. The doors are battered open. All the people are captured and taken away in chains. And, they've captured the religious heart symbol of the Christian city, really. And of course, it's all over at that point.
And do any of the Unionist churchmen think, not the Unionist churchmen, the people who had opposed union with the West, do they think, gosh, maybe we got that wrong?
It's very difficult to know. I mean, everybody, of course, was horrified. Whether you were Orthodox or not, a lot of people were just dragged away into slavery. So we don't have any evidence as to how they felt, although Mehmet does retain and support the patriarch of the Orthodox community, which will be reestablished. But I think there was a massive population hemorrhage after the siege. An awful lot of people were just taken away as goods.
I think you said in your book that Mehmet is entitled to a third of the slaves and he releases them back into the city?
Yes, he did. He's quite keen to try and win hearts and minds, actually. Most of the people in this city are Greek, and it's going to be a long time, actually, before a Turkish population outnumbers the Greek population in this place. And it's a canny strategy because, of course, he keeps Christianity divided, really, by favouring and allowing the Greeks to conduct their own affairs within the limits of Sultan's rule. And generally, although, one shouldn't have too rosy a picture of it, there's no attempt to convert Christians to Islam because they're all people of the book. So, although it remains a bitter thing for Greek people, it wasn't the end of Christianity within that city. They had their churches. Of course, a lot of the best churches were taken over as mosques, including St. Sophia. But a Christian life continued to be led within the city for hundreds of years, right up into this century.
I don't know if people will know, or most people will know, what was the death knell of really Greek Christianity in Istanbul?
It probably doesn't happen until the start of the 20th century. The last days of the Ottoman Empire, when they certainly perceived Greeks to be a fifth column in Asia Minor, the Greek invasion of Asia Minor in 1921 to 23 sees the ousting of a Greek of a Greek population. The view is going to harden, and it keeps coming in waves. The Cyprus crisis, for example. At each of these moments when of heightened tension between Greeks, another swathe of the Greek population go. And I think there is only a tiny rump of Greek population there now, although the supreme authority of the Greek Orthodox Church remains the Patriarch of Constantinople. And only in 2005 did a Greek cabinet minister ever use the word Istanbul. Up till then, it remained Constantinopolis. And the emotional attachment to it is huge.
But in your book, it was a fairly miserable story in a way, this sort of catastrophe of an empire that's gone on for, a city that's lasted for over 1,000 years. But you sort of had quite a nice take on it at the end, where you made the point that it sort of has moved from being something that had declined to the point where it was just almost a ghost, and that in some ways the Ottoman takeover for the city itself was maybe not the worst thing that could have happened.
No, I mean, the population had shrunk hugely, and there were vast tracts of uncultivated land inside the city walls. The population had drained away, and so this was effectively a dying city. And under the Ottomans, they bring it back to life. They forcibly move people to the city. They repopulate it. The Sultans establish their palace there, the Topkapi Palace. It becomes a more dynamic, what it had been under the Byzantines, a dynamic center of trade. This is a city that comes back to life under the Ottomans. The huge building program of mosques. It becomes a city of extraordinary vitality, great beauty of a different sort, and really continues to be what it still is in a way, a remarkable city in a remarkable place.
I don't think I have any other questions. We'll have recorded for 2 hours. So. Is there anything else that you think we missed?
I'd like to just finish off with one kind of vignette of suffering, I think, that the Greek people experience. It's the tale of a man called George Francis and his survival. He was a very close friend of Constantine's. They'd been godfathers to each other's children, and he had stayed in the city with his wife and family. He had a lot to lose. He and his wife do get away, and they finish their days in monasteries on Corfu, but his children don't. His children are taken into the Sultan's palace, into the seraglio. His son is executed. They're young, 13, 14, is executed that year. His daughter probably goes into the harem, but she dies of an illness a couple of years at the age of 14. And Francis wrote a short memoir as a monk on Corfu. And he says, "It would be better if I had never been born or if I had died in infancy." The pain and the loss of his family was almost unbearable. And I think we can take this as standing as one example of really the human cost for the losing side.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. Thanks. Okay, that's good. I might put that in at the very end, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that seems an excellent place to end it. So thank you so much, Roger, for coming on and talking to us about it. That was absolutely terrific.
Thanks very much, Russell.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.